Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Night Fear Stories. Tonight, we bring you 9 bone-chilling tales from the heart of the ancient Appalachian Mountains, where darkness has lingered for centuries and supernatural forces refuse to rest. In this episode, we will journey deep into the shadowed hollows and mist-covered peaks with 9 harrowing accounts of encounters with entities that defy explanation. These stories are drawn from the terrifying experiences of those who ventured into these cursed mountains and lived to share their tales. Each narrative has been meticulously researched from first-hand testimonies of individuals who claim to have witnessed phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality itself. To protect the privacy and safety of those who courageously came forward, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the authenticity of their experiences. These mountains hold secrets older than recorded history, and tonight you will discover why locals whisper warnings about venturing too deep into the Appalachian wilderness after dark. If you are new to Night Fear Stories, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what lurks beyond the veil of our everyday world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when ancient terrors call out from the shadows. A man named Leo used to work as a park ranger in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, stationed at a remote outpost near Pine Ridge Trail. It was a job that required long stretches of solitude, patrolling miles of wilderness where cell phone towers couldn't reach, and the nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads away. Most people would find the isolation unsettling, but he had always been drawn to the quiet beauty of these ancient mountains, the towering hemlocks, the crystal-clear streams cutting through valleys that had remained unchanged for millennia, and the way morning mist clung to the peaks like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky. It was peaceful work, or so he thought, until he learned about Alara. The first time he heard about the missing woman was during his initial briefing with his supervisor, Marcus Thorne, a weathered man who had spent 30 years working these mountains. He mentioned her almost in passing, the way one might reference an old scar that still aches when the weather changes. Alara Vance had been a local woman, 26 years old, who had disappeared somewhere along Pine Ridge Trail 3 years before Leo arrived. Search and rescue teams had scoured every inch of the area for weeks, but they never found so much as a piece of clothing or a footprint to indicate what had happened to her. The case had gone cold, filed away with the other unexplained disappearances that seemed to plague these mountains with disturbing regularity. What Marcus didn't tell him during that first conversation, what Leo wouldn't learn until much later, was that Alara had not been the first person to vanish along that particular stretch of trail. Over the past 2 decades, 7 different hikers had disappeared in the same general area, all under circumstances that made no logical sense. They were experienced outdoorsmen and women who knew these mountains like their own backyards, people who would never have gotten lost or taken unnecessary risks. They had simply walked into the forest one day and never walked back out. Leo's first few months on the job passed without incident. He settled into the rhythm of his daily rounds, checking campgrounds, maintaining trail markers, and occasionally helping lost tourists find their way back to civilization. The work was exactly what he had hoped it would be when he applied for the position, challenging enough to keep him engaged, but peaceful enough to provide an escape from the chaos of city life. He had grown up in Charleston, where the constant noise of traffic and construction had made it impossible for him to think clearly. Here in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of wind through the trees and the distant calls of hawks circling overhead, he felt like he could finally breathe again. The first time he heard the whistling was on a Tuesday evening in late October. He had been hiking back toward the ranger station after checking on a group of campers who had reported seeing bear tracks near their site. The sun was beginning to set behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the forest floor and painting the autumn leaves in shades of gold and crimson that took his breath away. He was perhaps 2 miles from the station when he heard it, a clear, melodic sound that seemed to drift through the trees from somewhere ahead of him on the trail. At first, he assumed it was another hiker, someone walking ahead of him who was whistling to keep themselves company as darkness approached. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any tune he had ever heard before, with notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, and harmonies that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He quickened his pace, thinking he might catch up with whoever was making the sound and make sure they had proper gear for hiking after dark. These mountains could be treacherous, even for experienced hikers, once the sun went down, and he had seen too many rescue operations that could have been avoided with a simple conversation about safety. But no matter how fast he walked, the whistling always seemed to stay the same distance ahead of him. It never got closer, but never faded away either. He called out several times, shouting hello and identifying himself as a park ranger. But there was never any response except for the continuation of that strange, beautiful melody that seemed to be calling him deeper into the forest. After following the sound for nearly an hour, he realized that he was no longer on the main trail. Somehow, without noticing when or how it had happened, he had been led onto a narrow deer path that wound through thick underbrush and around massive boulders that he didn't recognize. The rational part of his mind told him to turn around immediately and retrace his steps back to familiar territory. He had been trained never to leave marked trails without proper equipment and backup communication, and he was violating every safety protocol by continuing to follow this mysterious sound deeper into uncharted wilderness. But the melody was so compelling, so achingly beautiful, that he found himself unable to stop walking toward it. It felt like the most important thing in the world was to discover who was making this music, and why it seemed to resonate with something deep in his chest that he had never known existed. The whistling led him through a grove of ancient oaks whose trunks were so massive that it would have taken 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of silver and shadow on the forest floor that made it difficult to distinguish between rocks and fallen logs. He stumbled several times, catching himself on low-hanging branches that seemed to reach out and grab at his clothes like gnarled fingers trying to hold him back. Still, the melody continued to draw him forward, always just out of sight around the next bend in the path. It was nearly midnight when he finally saw her. She was standing in a small clearing perhaps 50 yards ahead of him, her back turned toward the trail so that he couldn't see her face. Even in the dim moonlight, he could tell that she was wearing clothes that seemed out of place in this wilderness setting. A long, flowing dress that appeared to be white or pale yellow. Certainly not the kind of practical hiking attire that anyone with sense would wear on these treacherous mountain paths. Her hair was long and dark, falling past her shoulders in waves that moved gently in the night breeze. The whistling was definitely coming from her direction, though he couldn't see her mouth moving or any indication that she was the source of the haunting melody. He called out to her, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed clearing, but she didn't turn around or acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply continued to stand there, perfectly still, except for the subtle movement of her hair in the wind, while that beautiful, terrible music continued to fill the air around them. He took several steps closer. Close enough that he should have been able to hear her breathing or see the movement of her shoulders as she drew air into her lungs to create the whistling sound, but there was no movement at all. And when he strained his ears, he realized that he could not hear any human sounds coming from her direction. No breathing, no rustling of fabric, no small movements that every living person makes unconsciously, even when they are trying to stand perfectly still. That was when the fear hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Every instinct he possessed began screaming at him to run, to get as far away from this clearing and this impossible woman as quickly as his legs could carry him. But when he tried to take a step backward, he discovered that his feet would not obey the commands from his brain. He stood frozen in place, unable to move forward or retreat, while the whistling grew louder and more complex, adding harmonies and counter-melodies that no human throat could possibly produce. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the woman began to turn around. He wanted desperately to close his eyes, to look away, to avoid seeing whatever was about to be revealed to him. But he found that he had no control over his body anymore. He could only stand there and watch as she rotated in place like a figure on a music box, her movements too smooth and fluid to belong to anything made of flesh and bone. When she completed her turn and faced him directly, he understood why Alara Vance and all the others had never returned from these mountains. The thing that wore the shape of a woman had a face that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, with features that seemed to shift and change depending on how the moonlight struck them. Her eyes were completely black, not just the irises, but the entire visible surface, as if he were looking into two deep wells that had no bottom. Her mouth was open in the shape of whistling, but he could see that there were too many teeth inside, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth, and they gleamed white and sharp in the pale light. The melody continued to pour from that impossible throat, wrapping around him like invisible chains that grew tighter with each passing note. He could feel his consciousness beginning to fade around the edges, his vision growing dark and fuzzy as the whistling invaded his mind and replaced his thoughts with its hypnotic rhythm. Part of him wanted to surrender to it, to let the music carry him away to wherever Alara and the others had gone. It would have been so easy to simply stop fighting and allow himself to be consumed by the beauty of the sound. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard Marcus Thorne's voice from that first day, warning him about the dangers these mountains held for those who were not careful. He remembered the missing persons files, the families who still waited for loved ones to come home, the search teams who had risked their own lives looking for people who had simply vanished without a trace. He thought about his own family, his parents and sister, who would never understand what had happened to him if he disappeared the same way. With every ounce of strength he could summon, he forced his right foot to take a single step backward. The movement broke whatever spell had been holding him in place, and suddenly he could move again. The thing that had been Alara let out a sound that was no longer beautiful, a shriek of rage and disappointment that seemed to come from everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. He turned and ran faster than he had ever run in his life, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, guided only by some miraculous instinct that led him back toward the main trail. He didn't stop running until he reached the ranger station. And even then, he spent the rest of the night sitting on his porch with every light in the building turned on, listening for any sign that the whistling might be following him home. But the forest remained silent, except for the normal sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business. And when dawn finally broke over the mountains, he began to wonder if the entire experience had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. He never reported what he had seen that night, knowing that no one would believe such an impossible story, but he also never returned to Pine Ridge Trail. And whenever other rangers asked him to cover that section during their time off, he always found excuses to decline. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some whistles are not meant to be followed, no matter how beautiful they sound in the darkness of the Appalachian night. Back when he was doing archaeological research in eastern Kentucky, Dr. Alastair Finch thought he understood what it meant to uncover the past. He had spent 4 years in graduate school learning proper excavation techniques, studying artifact classification systems, and memorizing the cultural chronologies of various Native American groups that had inhabited the Appalachian region over the past several thousand years. He believed that archaeology was a science, a methodical process of revealing historical truths through careful analysis of physical evidence. He was completely unprepared for what he would discover during his field work along Copper Creek, or for the way that discovery would challenge everything he thought he knew about the relationship between past and present. The project began as a routine cultural resource survey, the kind of preliminary investigation that federal law requires before any major construction can begin on public lands. The Forest Service was planning to build a new access road through a remote valley in the Daniel Boone National Forest, and they needed archaeologists to determine whether the proposed route would disturb any significant prehistoric sites. His advisor at the university had recommended him for the job, partly because of his academic performance, but mostly because he was one of the few graduate students willing to spend 6 weeks camping in the backcountry with minimal contact with the outside world. He arrived at the Copper Creek site in early June with his research partner, Dr. Helena Shaw, a fellow graduate student who specialized in prehistoric pottery analysis. They had worked together on several previous projects and had developed an efficient system for conducting surveys in challenging terrain. Helena was methodical and patient, qualities that made her excellent at the tedious work of carefully excavating and cataloging artifacts, while Alastair was better at reading landscapes and identifying areas where prehistoric peoples were most likely to have established camps or settlements. The valley they were assigned to survey was breathtakingly beautiful, a narrow corridor carved by centuries of flowing water between steep ridges that rose nearly 1,000 feet above the creek bed. Ancient hemlocks and white pines towered overhead, creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the summer sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. The creek itself was crystal clear, running over a bed of smooth stones that had been polished by countless seasons of spring floods and summer droughts. It was the kind of place that would have been ideal for Native American occupation, with abundant fresh water, fertile bottomland for growing crops, and easy access to the upland hunting grounds on the surrounding ridges. Their initial survey revealed exactly what they had expected to find. Along the terraces above the creek, they discovered scattered concentrations of flint chips and broken pottery that indicated prehistoric camps dating back at least 1,000 years. Most of the artifacts were typical of what archaeologists call the late woodland period, when indigenous peoples in this region lived in small villages and practiced a mixed economy of hunting, gathering, and agriculture. The pottery fragments showed the characteristic cord-marked surfaces and simple rim decorations that they had seen at dozens of similar sites throughout eastern Kentucky. But there were also artifacts that did not fit the usual patterns, pieces that seemed somehow wrong in ways that Alastair struggled to articulate. Some of the stone tools were made from materials that did not occur naturally in this part of Kentucky, exotic cherts and obsidians that would have had to be traded from hundreds of miles away. More disturbing were the bone implements, carved pieces that appeared to be needles or awls, but were decorated with symbols that he could not identify despite years of studying Native American iconography. The symbols were not pictographic representations of animals or natural phenomena, as was typical of prehistoric art in this region, but abstract designs that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light struck them. Helena was the first to notice that something was watching them. They had been working at the site for nearly 2 weeks when she mentioned that she had been feeling observed while excavating her test units. At first, she attributed the sensation to the normal hyper-awareness that comes from working alone in wilderness areas where bears and other potentially dangerous animals are common. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger rather than fading as her comfort level with the environment increased. She described it as a presence that seemed to move through the forest just beyond the range of her peripheral vision, always staying hidden behind trees or boulders, but never quite going away. When she would turn to look directly at the spot where she sensed movement, there would be nothing there except the usual forest scenery. But the feeling of being watched would persist, sometimes becoming so intense that she found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Alastair had been so focused on the unusual artifacts that he had not paid much attention to his own psychological state. But once Helena brought up her concerns, he realized that he had been experiencing similar sensations. There was definitely something unsettling about the sight, a quality of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, rather than from any external threat. The artifacts they were uncovering felt somehow contaminated, as if they carried traces of experiences that were too dark and complex for their academic frameworks to comprehend. The breakthrough came during their third week at the site, when Helena discovered a cache of artifacts buried beneath a large flat stone that appeared to have been deliberately placed as a marker or memorial. The cache contained more of the strange bone implements along with several pieces of pottery that were unlike anything either of them had ever seen. The vessels were small and delicate, with surfaces that had been burnished to an almost mirror-like finish, and then decorated with the same abstract symbols they had found on the bone tools. But the most disturbing item in the cache was a small figurine carved from what appeared to be human bone. The figure was roughly humanoid in shape, but with proportions that were subtly wrong, arms that were too long and a head that was too large for the body. The face had been carved with meticulous attention to detail, showing features that were human enough to be recognizable but alien enough to be deeply unsettling. The eyes were wide and staring, with pupils that seemed to follow your gaze no matter what angle you viewed the figurine from. Helena refused to handle the figurine directly after the first time she picked it up. She claimed that touching it had given her a powerful sensation of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly become unstable. She also reported experiencing vivid and disturbing dreams that night, images of figures moving through the forest that were similar to the carved figurine, but much larger and more threatening. Alastair initially dismissed her concerns as the result of suggestion and isolation-induced stress, psychological phenomena that are well documented among researchers working in remote locations. But when he examined the figurine himself, he had to admit that there was something profoundly unsettling about the object. The bone it was carved from had an unusual texture and color, darker than normal human bone, and with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. More troubling was the way the figurine seemed to radiate a subtle but persistent sense of malevolence, as if it had been created not as an artistic expression, but as a vessel for containing something that should not be allowed to escape. That night, he experienced the first of what would become a series of increasingly disturbing encounters with whatever presence inhabited the Copper Creek Valley. He awoke around 3 o'clock in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling their campsite, slow and deliberate movements that seemed too large and heavy to belong to any animal native to these mountains. When he peered out through the mesh window of his tent, he could see a tall figure standing at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the range where he could make out specific details. The figure appeared to be roughly human in shape, but with proportions that matched those of the bone figurine they had discovered earlier that day. It stood perfectly still for what felt like hours, never moving closer, but never retreating either, simply watching their camp with an intensity that he could feel even though he could not see its eyes clearly. He wanted to wake Helena and point out the intruder, but he found that he was unable to move or speak. as if the act of observing this thing had somehow paralyzed his ability to take any action. When dawn finally broke and the figure disappeared back into the forest, he convinced himself that the entire experience had been a particularly vivid nightmare, brought on by spending too much time thinking about the disturbing artifacts they had been uncovering. But Helena reported having almost identical experiences, and over the following nights, the encounters became more frequent and more intense. The presence began appearing during daylight hours as well, always staying just far enough away that they could not see it clearly, but close enough that they could sense its constant observation. Their work became increasingly difficult as they found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders and jumping at every sound in the forest around them. The artifacts they continued to uncover seemed to be getting more disturbing as well, including several more bone figurines and a collection of stone implements that appeared to have been designed for purposes that he preferred not to contemplate. The final encounter occurred during their last week at the site. Helena had been working alone at a test unit located about 50 yards upstream from their main excavation area, while Alistair cataloged artifacts back at their camp. When she failed to respond to his calls for lunch, he walked over to check on her progress and found her test unit empty, with her excavation tools scattered on the ground as if she had dropped them suddenly and walked away. He called her name repeatedly while searching the immediate area, but there was no response except for the normal sounds of the forest. Her personal belongings were still in her tent, and there were no signs of a struggle or any indication of what might have caused her to leave so abruptly. He spent the rest of the day searching every inch of the valley, following Copper Creek both upstream and downstream for miles, calling her name until his voice gave out. When darkness fell and she still had not returned, he hiked out to the nearest road and contacted the Forest Service. Search and rescue teams arrived the next morning and spent 5 days combing the area with dogs and helicopters. But they found no trace of Helena or any clue about what had happened to her. The official report concluded that she had probably fallen into the creek and been swept away by the current, despite the fact that the Copper Creek was barely knee-deep at that time of year and flowed too slowly to pose any danger to an experienced outdoorswoman. Alistair never returned to complete the archaeological survey, and the Forest Service eventually canceled the road construction project for reasons that were never clearly explained to him. The artifacts they had collected were stored in boxes in the university laboratory, where they remain to this day. He has never written the final report that would have been required to complete the project, partly because he cannot explain what they discovered in any way that would be acceptable to the academic community. Sometimes he wonders if Helena is still alive somewhere in those mountains, if whatever presence they encountered decided to keep her, rather than simply making her disappear like the others who have vanished in that region over the years. But he suspects that wondering about such things is a path that leads nowhere good. And he has learned that some questions are better left unasked, especially when they concern the things that watch from the shadows of Copper Creek. In October of 2019, a hiker named Rowan and his hiking buddy, Jasper, decided to explore an unmarked trail they had discovered on an old geological survey map from the 1940s. The trail was located in a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains, far from the popular tourist routes that drew millions of visitors each year to witness the famous autumn foliage displays. They were experienced hikers who had spent countless weekends exploring the backcountry areas of Tennessee and North Carolina, always searching for hidden places that had not yet been discovered by the crowds of casual hikers who clogged the main trails with their noise and litter. Jasper was the kind of person who thrived on discovering places that didn't appear in guidebooks or on modern hiking websites. He had an extensive collection of historical maps dating back to the early days of the national park system, and he spent hours studying topographical features, and comparing them to current trail systems to identify areas that might have been accessible to hikers in previous decades, but had since been forgotten or abandoned. His apartment was filled with boxes of old maps, survey reports, and historical documents that he had collected from estate sales and government surplus auctions over the years. The trail they had chosen for their October expedition was marked on his 1940s map as the Lonesome Hollow Trail, a designation that did not appear on any modern maps or Park Service documentation. According to the historical survey notes, the trail had originally been constructed as an access route to a series of abandoned mining claims that had been worked briefly during the 1930s before being deemed economically unviable. The mines had been sealed and abandoned sometime in the early 1940s, and the trail had apparently been allowed to grow over and fade back into the forest. They began their hike on a crisp Saturday morning in mid-October when the autumn colors were at their absolute peak, and the forest was ablaze with shades of red, orange, and gold that seemed almost supernatural in their intensity. The unmarked trailhead was located at the end of a gravel Forest Service road that had deteriorated to the point where they could barely drive Rowan's four-wheel drive truck the final 2 miles without risking serious damage to the undercarriage. They parked in a small clearing that showed evidence of having been used by other vehicles in the past, though the tire tracks were old enough to suggest that while they were not the first people to discover this forgotten access point, they were certainly among the few who had visited it recently. The first few miles of the trail were in remarkably good condition, considering that it had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 80 years. The path was clearly defined and relatively easy to follow, winding through stands of mature hardwoods that had probably been second-growth forest when the trail was originally constructed. They made good time despite the steep grade, stopping frequently to photograph the spectacular views that opened up periodically through gaps in the canopy. Jasper was in excellent spirits as they hiked, sharing stories about other abandoned trails he had explored and speculating about what they might discover when they reached the old mining sites. He had brought along a metal detector and hoped to find artifacts from the mining operation, perhaps old tools or equipment that had been left behind when the claims were abandoned. Rowan was more interested in the natural features of the area, particularly a series of limestone caves that were marked on the historical map, but did not appear in any modern speleological surveys. The first sign that something was unusual about this particular hollow came when they realized that their GPS devices had stopped working properly. Both of their units showed the same error message, indicating that they were unable to acquire satellite signals despite the fact that they were hiking through relatively open forest with clear views of the sky overhead. They initially attributed the problem to interference from the steep ridges that surrounded the hollow, though neither of them had experienced similar GPS failures in comparable terrain elsewhere in the Smokies. More troubling was the discovery that their watches had stopped keeping accurate time. Rowan first noticed the problem when he checked his watch after what felt like several hours of hiking and found that it showed the same time as when they had started that morning. Jasper's watch was displaying a completely different time that bore no relationship to either Rowan's watch or his recollection of when they had begun hiking. They initially assumed that one or both of their watches had malfunctioned, but when they checked their cell phones, they showed yet another set of conflicting times. The trail began to deteriorate significantly as they descended deeper into the hollow. What had been a clearly defined path became increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow, with long sections where the route seemed to disappear entirely among the dense undergrowth. They found themselves relying more and more on the old map and compass bearings to maintain their general direction, though the landscape they were traversing seemed increasingly different from what the topographical features on the map suggested they should be encountering. The forest itself was beginning to feel wrong in ways that Rowan struggled to articulate. The trees were subtly different from what they had been hiking through earlier in the day, with species combinations that didn't make sense for this elevation and climate. Some of the plants appeared to be varieties that he had never seen before, despite years of hiking throughout the Appalachian region and a decent knowledge of regional botany. The undergrowth was unusually dense and seemed to resist their passage in ways that went beyond normal forest conditions. Most disturbing were the sounds, or rather, the complete absence of sounds that they should have been hearing. The forest was eerily quiet, with none of the bird calls, insect noises, or small animal movements that typically provide a constant background symphony in healthy woodland environments. Even their own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was somehow thicker and less capable of carrying sound waves over normal distances. Jasper was the first to notice that the light was behaving strangely. Despite the fact that they had been hiking for what felt like most of the day, the quality of sunlight filtering through the canopy remained consistently the same, never shifting from the golden mid-morning glow that had characterized the beginning of their hike. The shadows cast by trees and rocks maintained the same angles and intensity, as if the sun had become frozen in its position overhead rather than following its normal arc across the sky. They discussed turning back several times during the descent, but each time they reached a consensus to continue for just a little further, to see if they could locate the mining sites marked on the map. Part of their reluctance to abort the expedition was simple stubbornness, the natural human resistance to admitting defeat when faced with a challenging goal. But there was also something about the hollow itself that seemed to discourage them from leaving, a subtle but persistent influence that made continuing forward feel like the only reasonable option, despite the accumulating evidence that they had somehow gotten into a situation that was beyond their experience or understanding. The old mining sites, when they finally located them, were nothing like what they had expected based on the historical documents. Rather than the simple shaft mines and equipment foundations that would have been typical of 1930s mining operations, they found elaborate stone structures that appeared to be far older than anything from the 20th century. The stonework was sophisticated and precisely fitted, constructed from blocks of dark limestone that had been cut and shaped with a level of skill that seemed inconsistent with the primitive mining techniques that would have been available to Depression-era prospectors. More puzzling were the symbols carved into many of the stone blocks, intricate designs that bore no resemblance to anything from European American mining culture or known Native American iconography. The symbols seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which they were viewed, creating optical effects that were deeply unsettling and difficult to photograph clearly. Jasper attempted to document the carvings with his camera, but the images consistently came out blurred or distorted in ways that made the symbols impossible to study in detail. The mining shafts themselves descended far deeper into the earth than would have been practical for the small-scale placer operations described in the historical records. When they dropped stones into the openings, they never heard them hit bottom, even after waiting for what seemed like several minutes for the sound to echo back up from the depths. The air rising from the shafts had an unusual smell, not the typical mineral odors associated with underground excavations, but something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers that had been left to rot in still water. It was while exploring the largest of the stone structures that they made the discovery that convinced them they needed to leave the hollow immediately. Hidden beneath a collapsed section of roof, they found a collection of objects that clearly predated the supposed mining operations by centuries, or possibly millennia. The artifacts included carved bone implements similar to those that might have been used in religious ceremonies, along with pottery vessels decorated with the same shifting symbols that appeared on the stone blocks. But the most disturbing find was a series of human skulls that had been deliberately modified in ways that Rowan had never encountered in any anthropological literature. The craniums had been elongated and enlarged far beyond normal human proportions, with additional bone growth that created ridge-like protrusions along the tops and sides of the skulls. The eye sockets were larger than those of modern humans, and the jaw structures had been altered to accommodate dentition that was clearly not human in origin. When Jasper picked up one of the modified skulls to examine it more closely, both of them experienced a simultaneous and overwhelming sensation of vertigo, as if the ground beneath their feet had suddenly tilted at an impossible angle. The forest around them seemed to shimmer and blur, and for a moment, Rowan could have sworn that he saw figures moving among the trees, tall shapes that walked with a fluid gait that was somehow wrong for any creature that had evolved on Earth. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to convince them that they had discovered something they were not equipped to understand or investigate safely. They carefully replaced the skull where they had found it and gathered their equipment as quickly as possible. The hike out of the hollow became a nightmare of disorientation and confusion as the trail seemed to have changed while they were exploring the mining sites. Paths that they remembered clearly from the descent had vanished or led in completely different directions, and landmarks that should have guided them back toward the parking area were no longer where they expected to find them. They eventually found their way back to the truck as darkness was falling, though neither of them could explain exactly how they had navigated out of the hollow or how long the return journey had actually taken. Their watches and phones continued to display conflicting and impossible times. And when they finally reached an area with cell phone coverage, they discovered that it was somehow still Saturday morning, as if no time had passed at all during their expedition into Lonesome Hollow. They never returned to explore that area again, and they never filed any reports about their discoveries with Park Service archaeologists or academic researchers. Some things are better left undisturbed, especially in places where time itself seems to follow different rules than those that govern the ordinary world. A young man named Ethan grew up listening to his grandfather's stories about the old coal mines that honeycombed the hills around their family farm in eastern Kentucky. His grandfather, Silas, had worked underground for 37 years before black lung disease finally forced him into early retirement. During the long summer evenings of Ethan's childhood, Silas would sit on the front porch and share tales from his days deep beneath the earth. Most of his stories were about the dangers that miners faced every day, cave-ins and gas explosions and equipment failures that could kill a man in the blink of an eye. But there were other stories, too, darker ones that he only told when the mood was right and the night was quiet enough for whispers. The story that stayed with Ethan the longest was about something that happened during his grandfather's second year working the Deep Creek mine, back in 1962, when Silas was still young and foolish enough to volunteer for the most dangerous jobs underground. The Deep Creek operation was one of the deepest mines in the county, with shafts that descended more than 800 feet into the mountain, before branching out into a maze of tunnels and chambers that had been carved from the living rock over the course of several decades. According to Silas, the mine had always been troubled by strange occurrences that the veteran miners attributed to the restless spirits of men who had died in the tunnels over the years. Equipment would move by itself during the night shift. Tools would disappear from locked storage areas only to turn up in impossible locations days later, and workers would occasionally report hearing voices calling for help from abandoned sections of the mine where no living person could possibly be trapped. The management dismissed these reports as the kind of superstitious nonsense that was common among uneducated mountain folk. But the miners themselves took the phenomena seriously enough to develop elaborate rituals and precautions designed to appease whatever forces inhabited the deeper levels of the mine. They would leave offerings of tobacco and whiskey in certain chambers, avoid working alone in areas where accidents had occurred, and never speak disrespectfully of the dead while underground. The incident that changed Silas's perspective on these matters occurred during a particularly difficult week in late October when the mine was struggling to meet production quotas, and the foremen were pushing the crews to work longer shifts in increasingly dangerous conditions. Silas had been assigned to a two-man team tasked with extending one of the deepest tunnels in the mine, a backbreaking job that required them to work in cramped conditions hundreds of feet below the surface with minimal supervision and limited communication with the outside world. His partner for this assignment was a man named Elias Thorne, a quiet, methodical worker who had been mining coal since he was 16 years old and knew the Deep Creek operation better than almost anyone. Elias was the kind of man who could read the mountain like a book, predicting cave-ins iors before they happened and detecting dangerous gas concentrations by subtle changes in the smell of the air. He was also deeply superstitious about the supernatural aspects of mining, always carrying a small bag of blessed salt in his pocket and refusing to work in areas where men had died violent deaths. On the morning of October 24th, Elias and Silas descended to the lowest level of the mine to begin their shift in a tunnel that was being extended toward what the geologists believed was a rich vein of high-quality coal. The work site was located in one of the most remote sections of the mine, accessible only through a series of narrow passages that wound through the mountain for more than a mile before reaching the active mining face. They had been working for several hours, taking turns operating the pneumatic drill that was slowly eating its way through the solid rock, when Elias suddenly stopped what he was doing and stood perfectly still, his head tilted as if he was listening to something. When Silas asked what was wrong, Elias held up his hand for silence and pointed deeper into the tunnel they were excavating. From somewhere ahead of them, barely audible over the constant noise of the ventilation fans and mining equipment, came the sound of someone tapping on rock with a metal tool. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, exactly like the noise that would be made by a miner working with a handpick in the old-fashioned way that had been common before the introduction of pneumatic drills. Elias's face went white when he heard the tapping, and he immediately began gathering up their tools and equipment. When Silas asked what was happening, Elias explained that the tapping sound was coming from an area where the tunnel had not yet been extended, solid rock that could not possibly contain a working miner. He had heard similar sounds before in other mines, and they always preceded accidents or cave-ins that claimed the lives of anyone foolish enough to ignore the warning. But the production foreman had made it clear that the crew would face serious consequences if they failed to meet their daily quotas. And Silas was too young and too desperate for steady work to risk being fired for what might turn out to be nothing more than acoustic tricks caused by the complex geometry of the underground tunnels. He convinced Elias to continue working for at least another hour, arguing that they could always leave if the situation became more threatening. The tapping continued for the rest of their shift, sometimes growing louder and more insistent, other times fading to barely perceptible whispers of metal against stone. Even more disturbing was the gradual realization that the sound was not random, but was following a specific pattern, almost like a code that was trying to communicate some kind of message. Elias became increasingly agitated as the day progressed, jumping at every unexpected noise and constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to see something emerging from the darkness behind them. Near the end of their shift, as they were preparing to load their equipment onto the small electric cart that would transport them back to the mine elevator. They saw a light moving slowly through the tunnel ahead of them. At first, Silas assumed that it was another mining crew that had been assigned to work in an adjacent section, though he could not remember being told that anyone else would be working in this area. But as the light approached, it became clear that something was fundamentally wrong with what they were seeing. The illumination was too steady and too bright to be coming from any of the battery-powered headlamps that the miners used, and it moved with a floating, ethereal quality that seemed to defy the laws of physics. More disturbing was the complete absence of any sounds associated with human movement, no footsteps or voices or equipment noise that would normally accompany a mining crew. The light stopped approximately 50 feet away from where Elias and Silas were standing, hovering in the air at about chest height and casting long, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. In the glow of the mysterious illumination, they could see the figure of a man wearing the kind of mining clothes that had been common several decades earlier: canvas overalls and a cloth cap with a carbide lamp attached to the front. The figure appeared to be solid and three-dimensional, but there was something translucent about it that made it possible to see the tunnel wall through its body. It stood perfectly motionless for several minutes, as if studying Elias and Silas with invisible eyes, before slowly raising one arm and pointing deeper into the tunnel they had been excavating. Elias grabbed Silas's arm and started pulling him back toward the main passage, whispering urgently that they needed to get out of the mine immediately. But before they could retreat more than a few steps, they heard the sound of cracking timber and shifting rock that every miner learned to recognize as the warning sign of an imminent cave-in. The collapse happened with terrifying speed, tons of rock and debris cascading down from the tunnel ceiling and filling the passage they had just been working in. The ghostly figure and its mysterious light disappeared in the chaos, but Elias and Silas barely managed to escape with their lives, reaching the safety of the main tunnel just seconds before their work site was completely buried under thousands of pounds of stone. The official investigation into the cave-in concluded that the collapse had been caused by a combination of geological instability and inadequate support structures, exactly the kind of preventable accident that killed dozens of miners every year throughout the coal fields of Appalachia. But Elias insisted, until the day he died, that the ghostly figure had been trying to warn them about the dangerous conditions, and that they would have been killed if they had ignored the supernatural warning and continued working. Silas never saw the mysterious light again during his remaining years at the Deep Creek mine, but other workers continued to report similar encounters in the deeper levels of the operation. The phenomena became so common and so disruptive to mining operations that the company eventually sealed off several sections of the mine that were considered to be haunted, writing off the loss of accessible coal reserves as a necessary business expense. The Deep Creek mine was finally abandoned in 1978 after a series of accidents and equipment failures made it economically unviable to continue operations. The entrance was sealed with concrete and steel barriers, and warning signs were posted to keep trespassers from entering the dangerous underground passages. But according to local residents, the mysterious lights can still be seen on certain nights, glowing deep within the mountain where no living person has walked for more than 40 years. Ethan never believed his grandfather's stories when he was young, dismissing them as the kind of folklore that develops naturally in isolated communities, where dangerous work and limited education create fertile ground for superstitious thinking. But that changed during his senior year of college, when he was researching his family history for a genealogy project, and decided to visit the old Deep Creek mine site to take photographs and gather information about Silas's working life. The mine entrance was exactly where his grandfather had described it, though decades of neglect had allowed the forest to reclaim much of the surrounding area. The concrete barriers were cracked and weathered, and someone had cut through the steel mesh that was supposed to prevent unauthorized access to the sealed tunnels. Against his better judgment, and despite the numerous warning signs about unstable ground and toxic gases, he decided to explore just inside the entrance to see if he could find any artifacts from the mining operation. The tunnel was in worse condition than he had expected, with standing water on the floor and sections of rotted timber supports that looked ready to collapse at any moment. He had only walked about 100 yards into the mine when his flashlight began to flicker and dim, despite the fact that he had installed fresh batteries before beginning his exploration. As the beam of his light grew weaker, he became aware of another source of illumination deeper in the tunnel, a steady glow that seemed to be moving slowly in his direction. He told himself that it had to be another explorer or perhaps a maintenance worker checking on the condition of the sealed mine, but something about the quality of the light made him deeply uncomfortable. He turned around and walked quickly back toward the entrance, but the mysterious glow followed him the entire way, maintaining the same distance and never revealing its source. Only when he emerged into daylight did the phenomenon disappear, leaving him to wonder if he had experienced the same supernatural warning that had saved his grandfather's life more than 50 years earlier. He never returned to the Deep Creek mine, and he never told anyone else about what he had seen that day. But he finally understood why Silas had always spoken about the underground spirits with such respect and caution, and why he had always warned him that some lights are not meant to be followed, no matter how curious they make you feel. A man named Caleb has nightmares about shadow figures, but instead of telling people the truth about why he cannot sleep through the night without leaving every light in his apartment turned on, he always makes something up about childhood trauma or anxiety disorders. The real reason he's afraid of the dark has nothing to do with psychology, and everything to do with what he witnessed during a camping trip to Devil's Backbone Ridge in the mountains of eastern Tennessee during the summer of 2020. His friend, Finn, had been planning this backpacking expedition for months, poring over topographical maps and researching the area's history with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that characterized everything he did. Devil's Backbone was a narrow mountain ridge that stretched for nearly 12 miles through some of the most remote wilderness in the Cherokee National Forest, accessible only by a series of poorly maintained hiking trails that discouraged all but the most experienced outdoor enthusiasts. According to Finn's research, the ridge had acquired its ominous name sometime during the late 1800s, when early settlers began reporting encounters with mysterious figures that appeared to be made of living shadow. The phenomena had been documented sporadically over the decades by hikers, hunters, and Forest Service personnel, but the reports were always dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations or misidentification of natural phenomena like fog, unusual lighting conditions, or wildlife silhouettes. What made Devil's Backbone particularly intriguing to Finn was the consistency of the eyewitness accounts despite their wide temporal distribution. People separated by decades, and with no knowledge of previous sightings, would describe essentially identical encounters with tall, humanoid figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Entities that moved with fluid, unnatural gaits that suggested they were not bound by the same physical laws that governed ordinary matter. They began their hike on a sweltering Saturday morning in mid-July, when the summer heat was already becoming oppressive, even at the higher elevations where they planned to establish their base camp. The trailhead was located at the end of a gravel Forest Service road that had deteriorated to the point where they barely managed to navigate the final 3 miles without damaging the undercarriage of Caleb's pickup truck. The first day of hiking was challenging but unremarkable. A steady climb through dense hardwood forests that gradually gave way to more open ridgeline terrain as they gained elevation. They made good time despite the heat and humidity, stopping frequently to drink water and admire the spectacular views that opened up periodically through gaps in the canopy. By late afternoon, they had reached a suitable campsite on a level shoulder of the ridge that provided both protection from the wind and access to a small spring that would supply them with fresh water. Finn was in excellent spirits as they set up their tents and prepared dinner over a small backpacking stove. He had brought along a collection of books about Appalachian folklore and was eager to share stories about the various supernatural entities that supposedly inhabited these mountains. Most of his tales were familiar variations of the ghost stories and cryptid legends that are common throughout the rural American South. But he also had more obscure accounts that he had discovered in old newspapers and historical documents. The first sign that something unusual was happening came during the evening of their second day on the ridge, when they began to notice that the forest around their campsite was unusually quiet. The normal symphony of insect and bird sounds that had provided a constant background during their daytime hiking had faded to complete silence as darkness approached, creating an eerie stillness that made every small noise from their camping activities seem unnaturally loud. More disturbing was the gradual realization that they were being watched by something that remained just beyond the range of their flashlights and campfire. Neither of them could identify any specific visual or auditory evidence of an observer, but both developed the same uncomfortable sensation of being scrutinized by an intelligence that was studying their behavior with predatory intensity. Finn initially attributed the feeling to the normal paranoia that affects people when they are camping in unfamiliar wilderness areas. But as the evening progressed, the sensation of being watched became so intense that they found themselves constantly scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. They tried to maintain normal conversation and camping routines, but their voices became increasingly strained, and their movements more defensive as they unconsciously positioned themselves back to prevent anything from approaching without being detected. The first actual sighting occurred around 11 o'clock that night when Caleb was walking to the edge of their campsite to relieve himself before turning in for the evening. He had just finished and was turning back toward the tents when he caught a glimpse of movement in the forest approximately 30 yards away. At first, he assumed it was a deer or other large animal moving through the underbrush, but when he focused his flashlight beam in that direction, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Standing motionless between two large oak trees was a humanoid figure that appeared to be roughly 7 feet tall and unnaturally thin, with proportions that were subtly wrong in ways that his brain struggled to process. The entity seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight rather than reflecting it, creating a silhouette that was darker than the surrounding darkness and outlined by a barely perceptible shimmer that reminded him of heat distortion rising from hot pavement. The figure showed no reaction to being illuminated by his flashlight, remaining perfectly still for what felt like several minutes while he stood frozen with fear and disbelief. He wanted to call out to Finn, but found that his voice had disappeared completely, leaving him unable to produce any sound louder than a whisper. The entity seemed to be studying him with the same detached curiosity that a scientist might show when observing an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. When he finally managed to break free from whatever paralysis had gripped him and stumbled backward toward the camp, the figure simply dissolved into the darkness as if it had never existed at all. By the time he reached Finn and managed to stammer out a description of what he had seen, there was no trace of the entity and no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Finn listened to his account with the kind of patient skepticism that characterized his approach to all alleged supernatural phenomena. But Caleb could see from his expression that he was taking the report seriously despite his natural inclination toward rational explanations. He suggested that Caleb might have misidentified a bear or other large animal, but he also agreed to help him search the area where he had seen the figure to look for tracks or other physical evidence. Their investigation revealed no footprints, broken vegetation, or any other signs that a large creature had recently passed through the area where Caleb had seen the shadow figure. The ground cover of leaves and moss showed no disturbance of any kind, as if whatever he had encountered left no physical trace of its presence. Even more puzzling was the discovery that his flashlight batteries had been completely drained during the brief encounter, despite the fact that they had been fully charged at the beginning of the evening. The second sighting occurred the following night, when both Caleb and Finn were witnesses to phenomena that were impossible to dismiss as misperception or equipment failure. They had been lying in their respective tents for perhaps an hour, neither of them sleeping well due to the continued oppressive silence of the forest around them, when they both became aware of sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The noises were difficult to describe in conventional terms, but they resembled a combination of footsteps and something being dragged across the forest floor. The sounds moved in a circle around their campsite at a consistent distance of approximately 40 to 50 yards, maintaining the same slow, deliberate pace for what felt like hours. Occasionally, they would hear what sounded like whispered conversations, though they could never make out specific words or determine how many voices were involved. When Caleb finally worked up enough courage to peer out through the mesh window of his tent, he could see multiple shadow figures moving through the forest in the pattern suggested by the sounds they had been hearing. The entities were similar to what he had encountered the previous night, but appeared in different sizes and configurations, some roughly human in appearance, while others had proportions that were clearly not terrestrial in origin. The figures seemed to be engaged in some kind of coordinated activity that involved examining their campsite and equipment from various angles, though they never approached close enough for them to discern any details about their behavior or apparent purpose. They moved with the same fluid, unnatural gait that he had observed before, sometimes appearing to glide across the ground without any visible effort, other times seeming to phase in and out of existence like smoke or mist. Finn was awake and watching the same phenomena from his tent, occasionally whispering observations about what he was seeing to confirm that they were both experiencing identical hallucinations, or that something genuinely inexplicable was occurring outside their fragile nylon shelters. His voice carried a note of fear that Caleb had never heard before, despite years of friendship during which he had always maintained a facade of rational skepticism about supernatural claims. The shadow figures continued their mysterious activities until approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, when they gradually faded away as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Neither Caleb nor Finn attempted to leave their tents or investigate more closely during the encounter, both of them intuitively understanding that direct confrontation with these entities would result in consequences that they were not prepared to face. They broke camp immediately after sunrise and hiked out of Devil's Backbone Ridge as quickly as their physical conditioning allowed, abandoning their original plan to spend several more days exploring the area. During the long drive home, they discussed what they had experienced and tried to develop rational explanations for the phenomena. But neither of them could construct a theory that accounted for all the details of their encounters. Finn eventually concluded that they had been victims of some kind of mass hallucination brought on by altitude, dehydration, or environmental toxins, though he never fully committed to this explanation, and continued to research reports of similar sightings throughout the Appalachian region. Caleb found his rational approach comforting for a few weeks after their return. But the nightmares began almost immediately and have continued with relentless consistency for more than 3 years. The dreams always follow the same basic pattern, starting with him alone in a dark forest where he can sense the presence of the shadow figures watching from just beyond his ability to see them clearly. He knows that they are closing in, gradually moving with the same patient, predatory intent that he witnessed on Devil's Backbone Ridge. But he can never run fast enough or find adequate shelter to escape their inexorable pursuit. He wakes up from these nightmares in a state of absolute terror, drenched in sweat, and convinced that the shadow figures have followed him home from the mountains. The only way he can calm himself enough to function during the day is to keep every light in his apartment burning throughout the night, creating an artificial barrier of illumination that he hopes will discourage any supernatural visitors from making their presence known. He has never returned to Devil's Backbone Ridge, and he has no plans to ever venture into that particular section of the Cherokee National Forest again. Some encounters leave permanent scars on the human psyche, and some shadows are too dark to be banished by ordinary light, no matter how bright you make it burn in the hours before dawn. In February of 2021, a man named Jesse and his friend, Micah, were camping in the Daniel Boone National Forest during what was supposed to be a peaceful winter backpacking trip through some of the most remote wilderness areas in eastern Kentucky. They had been planning this expedition for months, researching trail conditions and weather patterns to find the perfect window when the temperatures would be cold enough to keep the insects dormant, but not so severe as to create dangerous hiking conditions. Micah was one of those methodical planners who approached every outdoor adventure with military precision, studying topographical maps until he had memorized every contour line and water source along their intended route. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger before returning to civilian life, and his combat experience had given him an almost supernatural ability to detect danger and navigate through hostile environments. If anyone could keep them safe during a winter camping trip in unfamiliar territory, it was Micah. Their destination was a remote valley that appeared on the maps as Massacre Hollow, though none of the modern trail guides or Park Service publications explained the origin of that ominous name. According to the historical documents that Micah had researched at the county library, the hollow had been the site of a brutal conflict sometime during the late 1700s, when frontier settlers and Cherokee warriors were engaged in the violent territorial disputes that characterized the early colonization of Kentucky. The details of what had happened in Massacre Hollow were unclear and contradictory, with different accounts blaming various parties for initiating the violence that had given the place its name. Some sources suggested that a group of Cherokee warriors had ambushed a family of settlers who were traveling through the area, while others claimed that white militiamen had attacked a peaceful Native American camp and murdered everyone, including women and children. What all the historical accounts agreed on was that the conflict had been particularly savage, and that many people had died in ways that were considered shocking even by the brutal standards of frontier warfare. The area had subsequently been avoided by both white settlers and Native Americans, acquiring a reputation as cursed ground, where the spirits of the dead continued to wander in search of justice or revenge. They began their hike on a gray Saturday morning when the temperature was hovering just above freezing, and the sky was heavy with clouds that threatened snow. The trailhead was located at the end of a gravel Forest Service road that had been poorly maintained and was barely passable, even with Micah's 4-wheel drive truck. They had to hike the final 2 miles to reach the actual start of the wilderness trail, carrying their heavy winter camping gear across terrain that was muddy and treacherous from recent thaw cycles. The first day of hiking was challenging but uneventful. A steady climb through dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine that gradually gave way to more open ridgeline terrain as they gained elevation. They made good time despite the difficult conditions, stopping frequently to rest and hydrate while enjoying the spectacular winter views that opened up periodically through the bare branches of the deciduous trees. By late afternoon, they had descended into Massacre Hollow itself, a narrow valley carved by centuries of flowing water between steep ridges that rose several hundred feet above the creek bed. The hollow was even more remote and isolated than they had expected, with no signs of recent human activity and an atmosphere of profound wilderness that made them feel like they were the first people to set foot in this place for many years. The valley was beautiful in a stark, winter way, with ancient hemlocks and rhododendron thickets creating a cathedral-like canopy over the frozen creek that ran down the center of the hollow. The snow that had fallen earlier in the week was still pristine and unmarked by animal tracks, creating a blanket of white that muffled all sounds and gave the landscape an otherworldly quality that was both peaceful and slightly unsettling. They established their campsite on a level terrace above the creek, choosing a location that would provide protection from the wind while still giving them access to fresh water and a clear view up and down the hollow. Micah was meticulous about their camp setup, ensuring that their tents were properly secured and that they had adequate insulation from the frozen ground that would otherwise drain their body heat throughout the night. The first sign that something was unusual about Massacre Hollow came during the evening of their first day, when they began to notice that the normal sounds of forest wildlife were completely absent. Even in winter, when many animals are hibernating or less active, one would expect to hear occasional bird calls, the scurrying of squirrels through the trees, or the distant howls of coyotes echoing across the ridges. But the hollow was wrapped in a silence so complete and profound that it seemed almost unnatural. More disturbing was the gradual realization that they could not shake the feeling of being watched by something that remained just beyond their ability to detect. Both Jesse and Micah developed the same uncomfortable sensation of being observed by an intelligence that was studying their behavior with intense scrutiny, though neither of them could identify any visual or auditory evidence of an observer. Micah initially attributed the eerie atmosphere to the isolation and the psychological effects of camping in a place with such a dark historical reputation. But as the evening progressed, both of them became increasingly convinced that they were not alone in the hollow. The feeling was so strong and persistent that they found themselves unconsciously positioning their chairs back to back around the campfire, creating a defensive formation that would prevent anything from approaching without being detected. The first time they heard the crying, it was around 11 o'clock that night when they were preparing to retire to their respective tents. The sound was faint and distant, barely audible over the crackling of their dying campfire. But it was unmistakably the sound of a baby or very young child crying with the kind of desperate, inconsolable distress that every parent learns to recognize as a sign of serious discomfort or danger. At first, they assumed that the crying was coming from some kind of animal, perhaps a fox or wildcat that was making vocalizations that their urban-trained ears were misinterpreting as human sounds. But as they listened more carefully, it became clear that what they were hearing was definitely the cry of a human infant, complete with the rhythmic breathing patterns and emotional inflections that no animal could replicate. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow, perhaps a quarter-mile away in the direction where the historical accounts suggested the original massacre had taken place. Micah immediately began gathering his gear and preparing to investigate, driven by the military training that had taught him never to ignore potential distress signals from civilians in danger. But when they tried to determine the exact direction and distance of the crying, They discovered that the sound seemed to be coming from multiple locations simultaneously, as if there were several babies crying in different parts of the hollow at the same time. Even more puzzling was the way the crying seemed to move through the forest in patterns that made no sense for any stationary source. The sound would fade away in one direction, only to reappear moments later from a completely different area, sometimes seeming to circle around their campsite at a consistent distance before moving away towards the upper reaches of the hollow. They spent nearly an hour listening to the phenomena and trying to develop a rational explanation for what they were hearing. But every theory they proposed was contradicted by some aspect of the crying that could not be accounted for by normal acoustic principles. The sound was too clear and too distinctly human to be animal vocalizations, too consistent and rhythmic to be wind or other natural phenomena, and too mobile to be coming from any fixed source like an abandoned cabin or hunting blind. Micah finally decided that they needed to investigate, despite the obvious risks and potential dangers involved in hiking through unknown terrain in complete darkness. He had brought along night vision equipment from his military days, and he was confident that his combat experience would allow him to navigate safely through the forest while locating the source of the crying. But when they extinguished their campfire and began moving toward the sound, they discovered that the crying immediately stopped, as if whatever was making the noise had detected their approach and decided to become silent. They waited in the darkness for nearly 20 minutes, listening for any resumption of the sound, but the hollow remained completely quiet, except for the normal whisper of wind through the evergreen branches overhead. When they returned to their campsite and relit the fire, the crying resumed almost immediately, coming from the same general direction, but now sounding closer and more urgent than before. The pattern continued for the rest of the night, with the mysterious infant cries persisting as long as they remained near their camp, but falling silent the moment they attempted to investigate or move toward the source. Neither Jesse nor Micah slept much that night, both of them too disturbed by the inexplicable phenomena to relax enough for rest. They took turns maintaining watch throughout the dark hours, listening to the crying and trying to convince themselves that they were experiencing some kind of acoustic illusion caused by wind patterns or geological features that they did not understand. But the second night in Massacre Hollow brought encounters that were impossible to dismiss as natural phenomena or psychological effects. The crying began again around the same time, but now it was accompanied by other sounds that were even more disturbing and harder to explain. They could hear what sounded like adult voices calling out in languages that they could not identify, though the emotional tone suggested panic, anger, and desperate pleas for help. More terrifying were the sounds of violence, the unmistakable noises of combat and struggle that seemed to echo across the hollow, as if a battle was being fought just beyond their ability to see the participants. They could hear the clash of metal weapons, the screams of wounded men, and the thunderous reports of musket fire that reverberated off the steep valley walls and filled the night air with the phantom sounds of warfare. The auditory hallucinations, if that is what they were, continued until dawn, creating a nightmarish soundscape that left both of them exhausted and deeply shaken. When the first light of morning finally began to illuminate the hollow, the sounds faded away gradually, leaving behind only the normal winter silence that had characterized the area during their daylight hours. They discovered physical evidence that something genuinely supernatural had occurred when they investigated the area around their campsite the next morning. The pristine snow that had surrounded their camp the previous evening was now marked by numerous footprints and impressions that had not been there when they went to bed. Most disturbing were the small footprints that appeared to belong to children, including some that were so tiny they could only have been made by toddlers or infants. The tracks formed complex patterns around their campsite, suggesting that multiple individuals had been walking in circles around their tents throughout the night, while they listened to the crying and other supernatural sounds. But there were no tracks leading into or out of the immediate area, as if the entities responsible for the footprints had materialized around their camp and then vanished without leaving any trace of their arrival or departure. Jesse and Micah packed their gear immediately after discovering the footprints and hiked out of Massacre Hollow as quickly as their physical conditioning would allow. During the long drive home, they discussed their experiences and tried to develop rational explanations for the phenomena they had witnessed. But neither of them could construct a theory that accounted for all the details of their encounters. They never reported their experiences to Park Service personnel or academic researchers, knowing that no one would believe such an impossible story without physical evidence that they could not provide. But Jesse has never forgotten the sound of those crying babies or the footprints in the snow that proved they were not alone in that cursed hollow, where the spirits of the dead continue to mourn the violence that claimed their lives more than 2 centuries ago. A man named Adrian from Tennessee used to be really into spelunking before an experience in the Cumberland cave system changed his perspective on what kinds of dangers might be lurking in the unexplored depths beneath the Appalachian mountains. He'd been exploring caves for nearly 8 years, starting during his college days when he joined the university spelunking club, and discovered that he had both the physical capabilities and psychological temperament necessary for navigating the challenging underground environments that most people find claustrophobic and terrifying. Cave exploration had become more than just a hobby for him. It was a passion that combined his love of adventure with his fascination for geology and his desire to discover places that had never been seen by human eyes. He had explored cave systems throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina, mapping previously unknown passages and documenting the unique formations that had been created over millions of years by the slow action of underground water flowing through limestone bedrock. The Cumberland cave system was one of the largest and most complex networks of underground passages in the southeastern United States, with more than 40 miles of mapped tunnels extending deep beneath the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Tennessee. The system had been discovered during the 1960s by a team of cavers from Vanderbilt University, but large sections remained unexplored due to the technical difficulty of navigating the narrow passages and vertical drops that characterized much of the network. What made the Cumberland system particularly intriguing to experienced cavers was its reputation for acoustic anomalies that had been reported by numerous exploration teams over the decades. The cave possessed unusual sound properties that could carry voices and other noises over incredible distances through the underground passages, sometimes creating effects that were so disorienting that cavers reported hearing conversations that seemed to be taking place in the same chamber when the speakers were actually miles away in completely different sections of the cave. Adrian had been planning an expedition to explore some of the unmapped sections of the Cumberland system for several months, studying the existing maps and consulting with other cavers who had experience in the area. The particular section he intended to investigate was located in the deepest part of the known system, accessible only through a series of increasingly narrow passages that required advanced rope work and specialized equipment to navigate safely. He began his descent into the cave on a Saturday morning in early November, when the cooler weather would make the physical demands of underground exploration more manageable. The entrance to the Cumberland system was located in a remote section of the Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, accessible only by a hiking trail that wound through dense forest for nearly 3 miles before reaching the limestone bluff, where the main cave opening was situated. The first few hours of exploration proceeded exactly as he had planned, following the well-mapped main passages that led steadily downward through a series of large chambers connected by crawlways and passages that were just wide enough to accommodate a person wearing caving gear. The formations in this part of the system were spectacular, with flowstone cascades, massive stalactites, and underground pools that reflected his headlamp beam like mirrors in the absolute darkness. As he descended deeper into the cave system, following passages that appeared on his map as thin lines marked with question marks to indicate areas where the mapping was incomplete or uncertain, he began to encounter the acoustic phenomena that had made the Cumberland caves famous among the spelunking community. Sounds seemed to behave differently in these deep chambers, with his own footsteps and breathing creating echoes that lingered far longer than they should have, and seemed to come from directions that made no sense given the geometry of the passages he was traversing. More unsettling was the gradual realization that some of the echoes he was hearing did not correspond to any sounds that he was making. There were faint noises that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in the cave system ahead of him, sounds that were too regular and purposeful to be caused by dripping water or air currents, but too distant and distorted for him to identify their source. The first time he clearly heard a human voice calling from the darkness ahead, he assumed that there was another caving team working in the area, though he had not seen any other vehicles at the trailhead and had not been informed of any other expeditions scheduled for that weekend. The voice was distant and echoing, but it was definitely human speech, though he could not make out the specific words or determine whether it was calling for help or simply communicating with other team members. He called out in response, identifying himself and asking if anyone needed assistance, but there was no reply except for the continuation of the distant voice, which seemed to be calling the same words over and over again in a rhythmic pattern that reminded him of a chant or incantation. As he continued moving through the cave system toward the source of the sound, the voice gradually became clearer, though the words remained unintelligible, as if they were being spoken in a language that he did not recognize. The voice was definitely calling his name, not just any name, but specifically Adrian, pronounced with perfect clarity and unmistakable intention. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cool temperature of the cave environment. There was no way that anyone else in the cave system could have known his name unless they had somehow followed him into the caves, and he had been extremely careful to ensure that he was not being pursued or accompanied by anyone during his solo exploration. As he moved deeper into the unmapped sections of the cave, following the sound of the voice that continued calling his name with increasing urgency and clarity, he began to notice other disturbing phenomena that suggested he had entered a part of the cave system where normal physical laws seemed to operate differently. His compass was spinning erratically, unable to maintain a consistent reading that would allow him to determine his direction relative to the surface world above. More alarming was the discovery that his carbide lamp was consuming fuel at a rate that made no sense given the amount of time he had been underground. He had brought enough supplies to support 12 hours of exploration, but his fuel gauge indicated that he had been in the cave for nearly 20 hours, despite the fact that his watch showed only 4 hours had passed since he entered the system. The voice calling his name was now clearly audible and seemed to be coming from a large chamber just ahead of him, through a narrow passage that required him to crawl on his hands and knees for approximately 50 yards. As he emerged from the crawlway into what appeared to be a vast underground cathedral, he discovered that he was not alone in the chamber. Standing in the center of the space, illuminated by a light source that he could not identify, was a figure that appeared to be human but was wrong in subtle ways that his mind struggled to process. The person was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing that might have been common a century or more ago. But the proportions were somehow off, as if the figure had been stretched or elongated beyond normal human dimensions. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the realization that the figure had no face in any conventional sense. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was simply smooth, pale skin that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Yet somehow, impossibly, the voice calling his name was definitely coming from this faceless entity, emanating from the general area where a mouth should have been located. The figure stood perfectly motionless except for small gestures with one arm, beckoning him to approach, as if it wanted to show him something or lead him deeper into the cave system. The voice continued calling his name, but now it was accompanied by other words that he could almost understand, as if the entity was speaking in English, but with an accent or dialect that was so archaic that the language had evolved beyond his ability to comprehend it fully. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to retreat immediately and get out of the cave system as quickly as possible. But he found that his body was not responding to the commands from his brain. He stood frozen at the edge of the chamber, unable to move forward or backward, while the faceless figure continued its silent beckoning, and the voice continued calling his name with increasing intensity. The paralysis lasted for what felt like hours, though his confused chronometer suggested that only minutes had passed. Finally, with enormous effort, he managed to force his right foot to take a single step backward toward the crawlway that had brought him into this nightmarish chamber. The movement seemed to break whatever spell had been holding him in place, and suddenly, he was able to move freely again. He turned and crawled through the narrow passage as quickly as the confined space would allow, driven by a terror that was unlike anything he had ever experienced during his years of cave exploration. The voice followed him, calling his name with what now sounded like anger or disappointment, as if the entity was upset that he had chosen to flee rather than approach and accept whatever invitation it had been offering. The journey back to the cave entrance was a nightmare of confusion and disorientation. Passages that he remembered clearly from his descent seemed to have changed configuration, leading him into dead ends or connecting to chambers that did not appear on his map. His compass remained useless, spinning wildly whenever he tried to use it to determine his direction, and his watch continued to display impossible readings that bore no relationship to his subjective sense of how much time was passing. Most disturbing was the persistent sensation that he was being followed through the cave system by something that moved without making any detectable sound. He could feel a presence behind him as he climbed through the passages toward the surface, and occasionally he thought he could see the faint glow of that mysterious light source reflecting off the cave walls behind him, as if the faceless figure was maintaining a constant distance while he struggled to find his way back to the outside world. He finally emerged from the Cumberland cave system after what felt like an eternity of confused wandering through passages that seemed to rearrange themselves when he was not looking directly at them. The sun was setting when he reached the cave entrance, though his calculations suggested that it should still have been early afternoon based on when he had begun his exploration, and the amount of time he thought he had spent underground. He never returned to the Cumberland cave system, and he never filed a report about his experiences with the National Speleological Society or any other caving organization. He has not done any serious cave exploration since that day, limiting his underground activities to well-known commercial caves where the risks are minimal, and the passages are well lit and clearly marked. Sometimes he still hears that voice calling his name in his dreams, the same urgent, insistent tone that beckoned him deeper into the darkness beneath the Appalachian mountains. He wakes up from these nightmares with the absolute certainty that something is still waiting for him in those unmapped passages, patiently calling his name and hoping that someday he will be foolish enough to return and accept its invitation to explore the depths that no living person was ever meant to discover. A woman named Lena inherited an old family property in the Blue Ridge Mountains that belonged to her great-aunt, Anomaly, before she passed away in 2018. The property consisted of nearly 40 acres of heavily forested mountain land in a remote section of western North Carolina. Accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound through the hills for almost 6 miles before reaching the rustic log cabin where Anomaly had lived alone for the final 30 years of her life. When Lena inherited the property following Anomaly's death, she had only vague childhood memories of visiting the mountain cabin during summer vacations, dim recollections of a stern but kindly woman who seemed to possess an almost supernatural knowledge of the forest and its hidden dangers. Her parents had always spoken of Anomaly with a mixture of affection and weariness, describing her as someone who had chosen to live according to the old ways and who maintained a deep connection to forces that most modern people preferred to ignore or dismiss. The decision to spend several weeks at the cabin during the summer of 2019 was motivated partly by curiosity about her family heritage, and partly by a desire to determine whether the property should be sold or maintained as a retreat for future generations. She had recently completed her graduate degree in environmental science and was between jobs, making it an ideal time to immerse herself in the wilderness and reconnect with the natural world that had shaped her ancestors for countless generations. The cabin itself was much larger and more sophisticated than she had remembered from her childhood visits, with hand-hewn log walls, a massive stone fireplace, and modern amenities that had been carefully integrated without disrupting the rustic character of the structure. Anomaly had been an accomplished craftswoman who had spent decades improving and expanding the original 19th century building, adding rooms and features that blended seamlessly with the traditional mountain architecture. More impressive was the extensive library that occupied most of the cabin's second floor, containing hundreds of books about Appalachian history, folklore, herbalism, and traditional mountain crafts. Many of the volumes were handwritten journals that documented generations of family knowledge about the supernatural forces that were believed to inhabit these ancient mountains, detailed accounts of encounters with entities that most people would dismiss as superstition or imagination. Lena spent her first week at the cabin reading through Anomaly's journals and trying to understand the worldview that had guided her solitary life in this remote location. Her writings revealed a complex system of beliefs that combined elements of Cherokee spirituality, European folk magic, and Christian mysticism into a coherent philosophy that viewed the natural world as populated by conscious entities that demanded respect and careful negotiation. According to Anomaly's records, the mountain where their family cabin was located had been considered sacred ground by the Cherokee people, who had inhabited the region for thousands of years before European colonization. The area contained numerous natural features that were believed to serve as portals or gateways between the physical world and the realm of spirits, places where the boundaries between different dimensions of existence were thin enough to allow communication between living humans and supernatural entities. The first sign that something unusual was happening at the cabin came during her second week of residence, when she began to notice that certain objects were moving from their usual locations without any apparent explanation. Kitchen utensils would appear in different drawers from where she had placed them. Books would be found open to specific pages that she had not been reading, and furniture would be repositioned in ways that created more functional arrangements, but that she could not remember making herself. Initially, she attributed these phenomena to the normal absent-mindedness that affects people who are adjusting to new environments and daily routines. But as the incidents became more frequent and more specific, she began to suspect that something beyond ordinary forgetfulness was responsible for the mysterious rearrangements of household items. More disturbing were the dreams that began occurring during her third week at the cabin, vivid nocturnal experiences that felt more like memories than products of her unconscious mind. In these dreams, she would find herself walking through the forest surrounding the cabin in the company of a tall, dignified woman who bore a strong resemblance to her childhood recollections of Anomaly. The dream figure would guide her to specific locations in the woods and point out natural features that possessed special significance, explaining in great detail the proper protocols for interacting with the spiritual forces that inhabited each area. The information conveyed in these dreams was remarkably consistent and detailed, including specific warnings about certain sections of the forest that should be avoided during particular phases of the moon, instructions for making offerings to the mountain spirits before harvesting wild plants, and elaborate rituals that were designed to protect the cabin and its inhabitants from malevolent supernatural influences. When she woke from these dreams, she would often find handwritten notes beside her bed that contained the same information that had been shared by the dream figure, written in a distinctive script that bore no resemblance to her own handwriting, but was identical to the style she had observed in Anomaly's journals. The notes were invariably written on paper that came from a pad she kept in the kitchen, suggesting that whoever was creating them had physical access to the cabin during the night while she was sleeping. The mystery deepened during her fourth week at the cabin when she received an unexpected visit from a distant cousin named Isolde, whom she had never met but who claimed to have been in regular contact with Anomaly during the final years of her life. Isolde was a woman in her 50s who lived in a nearby mountain community and who possessed the same air of quiet authority that Lena remembered from her childhood encounters with Anomaly. According to Isolde, she had been guided to the cabin by dreams similar to the ones Lena had been experiencing, nocturnal visions in which Anomaly had appeared to express concern about her welfare and to provide instructions for ensuring her safety during her extended stay on the mountain property. Isolde had brought with her a collection of items that she claimed Anomaly had specifically requested be delivered to Lena, including several pieces of handcrafted jewelry that were designed to provide protection from supernatural threats, and a leather-bound journal that contained detailed maps of the sacred sites located throughout the surrounding forest. Most importantly, Isolde had come to teach Lena about the family responsibilities that she had inherited along with the mountain property, obligations that extended far beyond simple ownership of real estate to encompass a role as guardian and caretaker of the spiritual forces that had been entrusted to their family's protection for more than 2 centuries. She explained that the women in their family had served for generations as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, using their knowledge of traditional mountain wisdom to maintain the delicate balance that prevented malevolent supernatural entities from causing harm to the broader community. Anomaly had been the most recent in this line of mountain matriarchs, and her death had created a dangerous vacuum that needed to be filled before the protective barriers around the sacred sites began to deteriorate. The process of transferring these responsibilities to Lena involved a series of elaborate rituals that had to be performed at specific locations throughout the forest during the dark phase of the moon. Isolde served as her guide and teacher during these ceremonies, leading her to hidden groves and natural shrines where previous generations of family matriarchs had maintained their supernatural guardianship for more than a century. Each ritual site contained physical evidence of the long history of family involvement with the mountain spirits, including stone altars that had been constructed from materials gathered in the surrounding forest, carved symbols that marked the boundaries between sacred and profane space, and offerings that had been left by previous generations to honor the entities that inhabited these ancient places. The most powerful of these sites was located in a natural amphitheater, formed by a circle of massive oak trees that were believed to be more than 400 years old. According to Isolde, this grove had served as the primary meeting place between their family and the mountain spirits since the early 1800s, when the first of their ancestors had arrived in this region and established the original homestead that had eventually grown into Anomaly's cabin. During the ceremony that formally transferred the guardianship responsibilities to Lena, she experienced direct contact with the supernatural forces that her family had been serving for so many generations. The entities appeared as translucent figures that seemed to be composed of moonlight and shadow, beings that possessed a dignity and ancient wisdom that commanded immediate respect and reverence. The spirits communicated through a combination of telepathic images and emotional impressions that conveyed complex information about the history of the mountain and the role that her family had played in maintaining the sacred balance between different dimensions of existence. They expressed gratitude for generations of faithful service and concern about the challenges that would face future guardians as the modern world continued to encroach upon the ancient wilderness. Most importantly, they confirmed that Anomaly's spirit had indeed been guiding Lena through her dreams and arranging the mysterious signs that had prepared her to accept her inherited responsibilities. Her presence was still active on the mountain, serving as a bridge between the living and the dead to ensure that the essential knowledge would be successfully transmitted to the next generation of family guardians. Lena returned to the cabin that night with a profound sense of connection to her ancestral heritage and a clear understanding of the obligations that would shape the rest of her life. The mountain property was not simply real estate that she had inherited, but a sacred trust that linked her to generations of family members who had dedicated their lives to protecting the spiritual forces that inhabited these ancient hills. The phenomena that she had initially attributed to imagination or coincidence now revealed themselves as manifestations of a supernatural reality that demanded her ongoing attention and respect. The moving objects, the mysterious notes, and the vivid dreams were all part of an elaborate communication system that allowed her deceased great-aunt to continue her protective work through her conscious participation in the family tradition. She has since established permanent residence at the mountain cabin, accepting her role as the current guardian of the sacred sites, and maintaining the rituals that ensure the continued cooperation between human and spirit communities in this remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The responsibility is demanding and sometimes frightening, but it has also provided her with a sense of purpose and connection to forces larger than herself that most people never have the opportunity to experience. Anomaly's presence remains active and supportive, manifesting through dreams, signs, and occasional direct encounters that reassure Lena that she is not alone in carrying out the duties that she faithfully performed for so many decades. The mountain spirits have accepted her as their new human representative, and she has learned to communicate with them using the traditional protocols that have governed these relationships for more than 2 centuries. The old ways continue in these ancient mountains, maintained by those who understand that some responsibilities transcend individual lifetimes, and that the welfare of the living sometimes depends on honoring obligations to the dead, who have not truly departed, but have simply taken on different roles in the ongoing drama of existence that unfolds in the hidden places where few people ever venture to look. A man named Evan's cousin, Kareen, always said their family was cursed, and he used to laugh at her whenever she brought up the old stories about supernatural afflictions that had supposedly plagued their bloodline for generations. She would tell these elaborate tales about great-great-grandmothers who had been tormented by invisible forces, ancestors who had been driven from their homes by malevolent spirits, and family members who had died under mysterious circumstances that defied rational explanation. He dismissed her stories as the kind of folklore that develops naturally in isolated mountain communities, where limited education and harsh living conditions create fertile ground for superstitious thinking. Kareen had always been drawn to the dramatic and the mysterious, collecting ghost stories and paranormal accounts with the same enthusiasm that other people devoted to stamp collecting or genealogy research. He assumed that her tales about their family curse were simply another manifestation of her lifelong fascination with the supernatural. His perspective on these matters changed dramatically during the summer of 2020, when he decided to organize a family reunion at the old homestead in Robertson County, Tennessee, where several generations of their ancestors had lived before dispersing to various parts of the country during the economic disruptions of the early 20th century. The property had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, but the original log house was still standing and appeared to be structurally sound despite decades of neglect. The reunion was intended to be a simple weekend gathering where distant relatives could reconnect and share stories about their common heritage. He had invited approximately 20 family members from across the Southeast, including cousins, aunts, uncles, and elderly relatives who possessed detailed knowledge about their genealogical history. Kareen was among the first to respond to his invitation, expressing both excitement about the reunion and concern about returning to what she described as the source of their family's supernatural problems. According to Kareen, their ancestral homestead was located less than 30 miles from Adams, Tennessee, where the famous bell which had terrorized the Bell family during the early 19th century. She claimed that their family had been present in Robertson County during the same period and had experienced similar supernatural phenomena that were somehow connected to the entity that had tormented the Bell household for several years. The Bell Witch case was one of the most well-documented paranormal incidents in American history, involving a malevolent spirit that had physically attacked family members, destroyed property, and ultimately claimed responsibility for the death of the family patriarch. The entity had demonstrated the ability to speak, sing, quote scripture, and engage in complex conversations with visitors who came to investigate the phenomena. The case had attracted national attention and had been investigated by numerous prominent figures, including future President Andrew Jackson. Kareen insisted that the same entity that had terrorized the Bell family had also visited their ancestors, though the incidents involving their bloodline had been less publicized and were known primarily through oral traditions that had been passed down through successive generations. She claimed to have documentation of these encounters in the form of family letters and diary entries that had been preserved by various relatives over the decades. The first sign that something unusual was happening at the reunion site came during their initial day of preparation, when several family members reported experiencing inexplicable equipment failures and technical difficulties. Power tools would stop working for no apparent reason. Cell phones would lose their charges despite being fully powered, and electronic devices would malfunction in ways that made it impossible to complete basic tasks like cooking meals or setting up sleeping arrangements. More disturbing were the sounds that began manifesting throughout the old house during their first evening on the property. Family members reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, voices engaged in muffled conversations that could not be understood clearly, and the sounds of furniture being moved around in parts of the house where no one was present. The phenomena occurred throughout the night, making it difficult for anyone to sleep peacefully despite their exhaustion from the day's activities. Corrine seemed less surprised by these developments than the rest of them, nodding knowingly when other relatives described their unsettling experiences and offering explanations based on the family history that she had researched extensively. According to her accounts, the supernatural activity always intensified when multiple family members gathered together in the same location, as if the presence of their bloodline triggered some kind of response from the entities that had been associated with their ancestors for generations. The second day of the reunion brought phenomena that were impossible to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. Objects began moving on their own throughout the house, with kitchen utensils, books, and personal belongings relocating themselves to different rooms without any human intervention. More frightening were the incidents of physical contact, when several family members reported being touched, pushed, or grabbed by invisible hands that left no visible marks but created sensations that were unmistakably real. Evan's elderly aunt, Beatrice, who was 86 years old and had never shown any interest in supernatural matters, became the focus of particularly intense activity during the second evening of their gathering. She reported being awakened repeatedly throughout the night by something that seemed to be trying to pull her blankets away and drag her from her bed. When other family members came to investigate her distressed calls for help, they witnessed the bed coverings moving on their own and heard a voice speaking in what sounded like an archaic dialect that none of them could understand. The voice seemed to be engaged in an argument or negotiation with some unseen presence, alternately pleading, demanding, and threatening in tones that conveyed intense emotion, despite the fact that the words themselves were incomprehensible. The phenomena continued for several hours, with the invisible entity apparently moving throughout the house and engaging different family members in similar one-sided conversations that left everyone feeling confused and deeply unsettled. Corrine spent most of that evening consulting the historical documents that she had brought with her to the reunion, comparing the phenomena they were experiencing with the accounts that had been recorded by previous generations of family members. She discovered numerous parallels between their current situation and incidents that had occurred at the same location during the 1820s and 1830s, when their ancestors had reported being visited by an entity that claimed to be associated with the Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. According to these historical accounts, the supernatural presence had identified itself as a relative or associate of the more famous Bell Witch, describing itself as part of a network of spiritual entities that had been active throughout Middle Tennessee during the early 19th century. The entity had demonstrated many of the same abilities that had characterized the Bell Witch phenomena, including the capacity for speech, physical manipulation of objects, and the ability to cause illness or other physical harm to human beings. The most disturbing aspect of the family documentation was the suggestion that the supernatural affliction had been passed down through successive generations, manifesting periodically when certain conditions were met, or when specific family members reached particular ages or life stages. The entity seemed to maintain a connection to their bloodline that transcended individual lifetimes, appearing to different relatives at different times, but always demonstrating detailed knowledge of family history and personal information that would have been impossible for an outside observer to possess. On the final day of their reunion, the supernatural activity reached a crescendo that convinced even the most skeptical family members that they were dealing with genuine paranormal phenomena, rather than psychological suggestion or environmental factors. The entity began speaking more clearly and frequently, engaging in conversations with multiple family members simultaneously, and demonstrating an intimate knowledge of personal details about relatives who had been dead for decades. Most chilling was the entity's apparent ability to predict future events affecting family members, providing specific information about health problems, relationship difficulties, and career changes that would later prove to be remarkably accurate. The predictions were delivered in a tone that seemed to combine concern for their welfare with a sense of possessive attachment, as if the entity considered itself to be a permanent part of their family structure rather than an unwelcome intruder. The supernatural presence also revealed information about the historical connection between their family and the Bell Witch phenomena, confirming many of the details that Corrine had discovered in her genealogical research. According to the entity, their ancestors had indeed been present in Robertson County during the period when the Bell family was being terrorized, and they had served as witnesses to some of the most dramatic supernatural events that had occurred during that famous case. More significantly, the entity claimed that members of their family had been recruited by the Bell Witch to serve as agents or assistants in its supernatural activities, helping to extend its influence to other households and communities throughout Middle Tennessee. This collaboration had supposedly created a permanent bond between their bloodline and the supernatural forces that had been active in the region during the early 19th century, ensuring that the paranormal connection would persist through successive generations. They concluded their reunion with a family meeting where they discussed their experiences and tried to decide how to deal with the ongoing supernatural manifestations that seemed to be an inescapable part of their heritage. Some relatives advocated for seeking help from religious authorities or paranormal investigators, while others argued that they should simply accept the phenomena as a family tradition that had been successfully managed by previous generations for nearly 2 centuries. Corrine emerged as their informal expert on these matters, using her extensive research to provide guidance about how to interact safely with the supernatural entity that had attached itself to their bloodline. She emphasized that the phenomena were not necessarily malevolent, but rather represented a complex relationship between their family and spiritual forces that required careful negotiation and respect to maintain in a manageable form. Evan left the reunion with a completely transformed understanding of his family history and a profound respect for the supernatural forces that had shaped their ancestral experience for generations. The curse that Corrine had always talked about was not a punishment or affliction, but rather a unique inheritance that connected them to spiritual realities that most people never encounter. The entity continues to manifest periodically in his own life, appearing during times of stress or major life transitions to offer guidance, warnings, or simply companionship from beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. He has learned to accept these encounters as a normal part of his existence, maintaining the respectful relationship that his ancestors established with forces that transcend ordinary human understanding. The family curse that he once dismissed as superstitious folklore has revealed itself to be a complex spiritual legacy that demands acknowledgement, respect, and careful stewardship to ensure that future generations will be able to maintain the beneficial aspects of their supernatural inheritance, while avoiding the potential dangers that come with such intimate contact with the unknown.